In this lecture, I'm going to start by giving some historical context and then jump into the first few lessons of the Lectures on Psychology by Bergson. And we will be looking at the psychological fact, the affective phenomena, pleasure and pain, sensation, feelings, inclinations, passions, sensibility in general, habit, freedom, instinct, many other topics. So I'm going to start really broad with the history of French philosophy in general, and then zoom in on Bergson and the historical intellectual context in which he was writing Matter and Memory, and at the time that he gave these lectures. So philosophy goes back pretty far in French history, back to at least the late medieval ages, where the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, began in 1045, drew thinkers from across Europe, such as Bonaventure, Aquinas, and Duns Scotus. Of course, at the end of the Middle Ages, what is called the early modern period, we have Descartes and Malebranche. Later, Leibniz will have a major impact on French thinking, and all three of these figures are instrumental in the marriage of science and metaphysics within French philosophical thinking during this period. And alongside Descartes as one of the most important thinkers of this period is La Rochefoucauld, who is not really widely remembered these days, but had an impact on all of French thinking. He used wit and wisdom to critique the moral status quo of his time, the assumed virtues and vices of his aristocratic society. Voltaire is somewhat squarely in his lineage, and there's even something in the moralism of Jean-Jacques Rousseau that seems to have some root in La Rochefoucauld. They all sort of take issue with the common way that people are predisposed to thinking and acting and understanding the world within aristocratic European societies. And another important figure here is Émilie du Châtelet, who brought Leibniz and Newton into the French intellectual scenes. And just around the time after Kant writes, there is a very little known French philosopher, Pierre Mandebéron, who greatly influences the tradition leading up to Bergson's philosophy. Mandebéron investigates his own lived experience. There's an introspective moral and metaphysical psychology which he develops by looking inward, looking at his experiences and analyzing in memory all that he has experienced. And from this sort of inner observation, intimate reflection, come to a metaphysical understanding of the soul that is inconsistent with the reductionist approach to understanding life and consciousness. And Mandebéron starts what is called French spiritualism, which will lead to thinkers such as Félix Ravissant, Paul Genet, and others, Boutreau, Leroy. And Ravissant is really the biggest out of these names, and he went to Germany and studied with Schelling, but is really far more indebted to Mandebéron, and there's more of a parallel between Ravissant and Schelling rather than a causal relationship of inspiration in one direction. Both Mandebéron and Ravissant wrote books on habit from the perspective of the being that is habituated, from the perspective of undergoing habits, having habits, of contracting them, and of shaping our behavior and our character. The other important figure from this time period, around the 19th century, is Victor Cousin, who had a philosophy of eclecticism, which was essentially a philosophy focused on history, on reading ancient Greek and Roman texts, and of sort of combining that with moral philosophy on the one hand and science on the other hand. So it's a kind of pluralism, and it did favor psychology, especially because of its roots in the ancient philosophy. But it was not as open to science as the later philosophy that follows it. It is a bit anti-naturalistic. And this leads to a pendulum swing in the opposite direction towards reductionism within the French academies. And then what we see in the time of Bergson is a swing back in the 1870s to what will be called spiritualism or scientific spiritualism, or what Bergson will call positive spiritualism. In the 1870s and 1880s, when Bergson is coming up through the school system, and at the end of the 1880s, finishing his doctorate and getting a position teaching at a high school, the French academies were full of sort of three main groups, we could say. Some spiritualist philosophers who tend in the direction of Kantianism, some philosophies that are based in empirical science but tend towards reductionism that ends by eliminating consciousness and interior experience of any kind. The emerging brain science of the late 19th century, which was being conducted mainly in Germany and England because of the Cousin era suppression of sciences, began to flood the universities in France, and one of their schools was led by Hippolyte Taine. His work is heavily indebted to Hume and Thomas Reid and the reductionist tendencies in naturalism. An important proponent of this view is Herbert Spencer, who Bergson himself says is the one in whose work he first encountered this extreme reductivism. And when he realized that the scientific intellectual mode of thinking had its limits. And on the other hand, we have some of these scientific spiritualist, positive spiritualist, new spiritualism, or spiritual realist philosophers and scientists, such as Claude Bernard, who studied biology and physiology, came up with an idea called the milieu intérieur, which is a inner space within the organized being, which allows for indeterminacy and freedom to enter into the living being's behavior. Adjacent to this is the term homeostasis and ideas of self-organization. Pierre Janet, psychologist, physician, and psychotherapist, whose discoveries in the field of dissociation, split personality, and traumatic memory were massively influential on later psychotherapy, from Freud to Piaget and Jung and Jules Lachelier. His work was more squarely within the realm of philosophy, and especially Kant, but he is something of a post-Kantian or heavily changing Kant's philosophy in order to fit it into a new paradigm, which is this scientific spiritualist paradigm. One of the main questions Lachelier was interested in had to do with epistemology, which is hugely influential on Bergson. Bergson dedicated his first major work, Time and Free Will, to Lachelier. And Lachelier says in the foundation of induction that we are to substitute everywhere force for inertia, life for death, and liberty for fatalism, and attempt to see life in terms of its vitality and dynamism rather than in terms of the static and cut up world of science and the scalpel. The question at the time was, what constitutes conscious activity? And this has been called the spirit problem. And the main claim of the spiritualists is that we need multiple methodologies, is that science is a completely valid form of knowledge, but it is insufficient to explain all of reality because it cannot explain the inner psychological reality. Bergson's rapid success in academia is largely in part due to the fact that he was answering a question that was pervasive at his time: how to make spiritualism and science agree, And as we'll see, Bergson will have to transform spiritualism in order to do so. Now, the spiritualist, this tradition that is in debt to Leibniz and Mander Biron, manifests in a number of different figures at the time. Jourdain, Brial, Bergson, Evelyn. Together, these thinkers made widespread reforms in education. And their purpose was to create the conditions in which this problem of spirit could be solved. Someone who could update spiritualism to the contemporary science. And Bergson was not the only one to answer this call. We also have Pierre Genet, who we'll talk about more later. But anyway, the spiritualists attempted to restructure the approach to psychology. The empirical reductive approaches to psychology had said that the psychological faculties, the faculties of our psychical life, perception, memory, imagination, things like that, these faculties could be localized in the brain and explained through mechanisms of the brain matter. The spiritualists want to stop talking about faculties because these faculties can be placed in the brain, and instead talk about psychological activities, and these activities cannot be localized in the brain. And one of the main features of this academic milieu, this conversation, this scholarly conversation, is the importance of the sensory motor, what today is called inactivism or the embodied mind, trying to understand intelligence and consciousness as embodied and as arising in our movement and perception of the world. Activities cut across the mind-body divide, as do habits and the habituation of the body, the habituation of the soul, the habituation of the mind. Bergson's lectures on psychology are, by and large, an introduction to the views on psychology belonging to the scientific spiritualism that I have just described. These lectures were given between the time of writing his doctoral thesis, his first major work, Time and Free Will, and his second work, Matter and Memory, which solidifies his method and establishes him as a deeply original thinker. The manuscript for the Course on Psychology, written down by Antoine Vacher at the Lycée Henri IV, Lycée Henri IV, Advanced High School in Paris. This manuscript did not present any publishing difficulties. The order and the style were clearly Bergson's own, and the content was verified by another student, Désiré Roustan. His version was essentially identical and taken contemporaneously. Bergson's lectures were clear and organized, as if he was reading from a book. They were in fact recounted from memory, without notes or script. He had already taught a course on psychology as early as 1884 at the Lycée Blaise Pascal in Clermont-Ferrand. In 1892-3, he taught a course on psychology designed to prepare students for the École Normale Supérieure. That is also available in French text. He repeated the course in 1893-4, and while there are considerable overlaps, there are also marked differences. Both courses are, by and large, introductions to the scientific or positivist spiritualism that existed in the universities of Paris since the 1870s. Félix Ravesson, carrying forward the work of Pierre Mander Biron from the context of the 18th century and transcendental philosophy to the 19th century intellectual advancements, and along with a number of other philosophers and psychologists, designed the curriculum and assessment to promote an approach to philosophy that holds in tension, harmonizes science and metaphysics. These thinkers were anti-reductionists and wanted the data and evidence on which we base our thinking to take into account both facts of observation, calculation, experimentation on the one hand, and on the other hand, facts of feeling, thinking, remembering, in a word, facts of spirit. These innovative thinkers forged into the contemporary science of the brain in the German and English literature. Paul Genet introduced this early neuroscience into French school systems and wrote a textbook on philosophy that was widely used in prominent high schools in preparation for ENS, and on which Bergson is likely to have based the main topics of his lessons. The editor of the 1892 lectures course, Sullivan Maton, very helpfully tracks many uncited references to the Histoire de la Philosophe, Genet's co-authored work with Gabriel Sellez. The second rendition of this course by Bergson feels almost like a prerequisite to making sense of his book Matter and Memory, which was published just 2 years later in 1896. He unpacks more slowly and sometimes even in greater detail than in his published works the subtle meaning of his most important psychological terms: inclination, tendency, effort, habit, feeling, sentiment, sensibility, intensity, attention, and there are many beyond these. These rich and nuanced terms go largely undefined in Matter and Memory or in Creative Evolution, making these lectures a privileged access point hitherto untranslated in English. We also get rare access to Bergson's views of the unconscious, unpacked here with more care and offering greater engagement with contemporary theories of his time. These lectures, unsurprisingly, also cover topics of his 1889 doctoral thesis on the immediate data of consciousness, known in English as time and free will. The central topics are rehearsed, such as psychophysics, quantification of feelings, intensity, effort, deep-seated sentiments, freedom, and free will. The 10th lecture on freedom being one of the longest and perhaps most comprehensive. He engages with these topics in a manner that is, in some ways, more accessible than in his doctoral thesis. The fact that these are high school lectures is rather astonishing from a contemporary perspective, given how deeply they penetrate some of the most difficult topics in psychology, metaphysics, and morality, as well as broad swaths of the history of philosophy and contemporary psychology. The classroom was in fact filled with both younger students and more advanced students preparing for the École Normale Supérieure. Bergson's genius for matching clarity with depth, accessibility with profundity, is more manifestly evident here than in any other text from the period, a trait that seems to emerge in his book Laughter and eventually wins him the Nobel Prize in Creative Evolution. Bergson mixes psychology, philosophy, and many of the questions enlivening his own thought at the time. In these lectures, we get special access to his interpretations and critiques of Leibniz, Hume, Kant, Mander-Biron, Ravison, as well as Darwin, Spencer, and James. We find the same cast of French and German psychologists that he engaged with in his published works: Taine, Ribot, Richet, Weber, Fechner, Lotze, just to name a few. Hippolyte Taine was the furthest on the spectrum of reductionist eliminativism, localizing all psychological functions in the brain and spine. The other thinkers fell on a spectrum moving towards neo-Kantianism and idealism. Bergson is closest to William James, his lifelong friend and admirer. Théodule Ribot and Gustave Fechner are probably the next closest aligned with Bergson's own views, though they still stir in Bergson, and he offers an important critique of them. The latter is typical of the intellectualism that Bergson also opposed. We see Bergson begin to carve out the form that his own science of the psyche will take by the end of Matter and Memory. After assimilating all he could of the facts revealed by these investigations made by his predecessors, after finding the faults in their views, he surpasses the tradition and institutes a new point of departure for a higher empiricism and a metaphysical psychology based on intuition. The central kernel of this approach to psychology draws its insights from what we could call the sensory motor schema, or in contemporary parlance of enactivism, the embodied mind. Bergson will give this emerging paradigm a greater philosophical depth, as will Pierre Genet, with his studies in psychotherapy, who Bergson admired and who he was certainly reading while writing Matter and Memory and giving these lectures. His ideas of automatism, hypnotism, split personalities, and things like the unconscious and tendencies find countless parallels across Bergson and Genet's work. Pierre Genet is Paul Genet's nephew, who Bergson would later hold a chair alongside at the Collège de France, and from whom Sigmund Freud would not only take influence, but in some cases, it seems, even stole some ideas. Bergson and Pierre Genet would have a significant impact on the field of psychology through figures such as Piaget and Jung, and many others. In both the renditions that Bergson gave of the course on psychology at Henri IV, Bergson begins by developing the notion of a psychological fact. This is a distinction between psychological and physiological facts, and it was commonplace in this scientific spiritualist atmosphere at the turn of the century. Charles Jourdain started his notions of philosophy by making this very distinction. Quoting Jourdain, "By consulting only the senses, the entirety of man's being resides in his body, and his life is merely the regular sequence of bodily functions. However, when we detach ourselves from the senses to turn inward, we discover, in the innermost part of our existence, an entire order of facts that have nothing in common with matter, such as thinking, remembering, reasoning, willing, loving, etc. These new facts are psychological facts, so named because our soul is their stage and subject, or even their cause. They constitute the primary object and foundation of psychology, or the science of the soul." On the distinction between psychological fact and physiological fact, let us bring to light some of the differences that exist between the psychological fact and the other facts of human nature amidst which they arise. Every moment I receive countless impressions from all the objects that surround me, modifying my organs, and these, through the mediation of nerves, reach my brain, which they also modify. There is a series of facts that occur in the body, which I know, like all physical facts, sometime in a superficial and coarse manner, when I am content to observe them with my eyes, and sometimes in a more accurate and complete way, when I have at my disposal a scalpel, a microscope to study them. But no matter how perfect the instrument I use they only ever reveal membranes, fibers, and cells within these membranes, and vibrations within these fibers. Physiology aims to understand facts of this order. Thus, they are called physiological facts. The beating of the heart, circulation of the blood, secretion of the bile are physiological facts. But at the same time, I receive impressions from external objects. I also know these objects, and after I have known them for the first time, I recall them. And not only do I recall them, but I also foresee what they will become later. I foresee, for example, that the sun will rise tomorrow and on the following days, just as it rose yesterday. Now, these facts of knowledge, memory, and foresight are profoundly distinct from the physiological facts that accompany them, having neither form, color, nor solidity. They do not fall under the senses. They escape the scalpel and the microscope. Just as I may be ignorant of what happens in my nerves upon contact with sensible things, and of the composition of these nerves, and even whether I have nerves, likewise, the physiologist, armed with the most delicate instruments, does not penetrate into the inner regions where our knowledge and memories and thoughts reside. So we can see there what influence Jourdain would have on Bergson, since Bergson is starting out with this very distinction. But Bergson is doing something slightly different and takes a sort of subtle approach to this question to try and work it out in a slightly different way than his predecessors. This little word, facts, takes on a dynamic and active sense for Bergson. Let me try and unpack this a little bit. Building on the etymology of the term, in Latin, facere, to make or fashion, we can see fact as not simply something already made, tot fait, all made, completely made, but more importantly, something in the making, and especially in the context of a psychological state, something in the process of making itself. A fact is also something evident. It is evidence, by which I mean a cause, a force in the mind, which initiates the emergence of thoughts and ideas and philosophizing. Something appears evident but problematic, producing wonder and initiating our further investigation. A psychological fact is therefore an act, a making, and a revealing, rather than a static representation or proposition. It is neither internal nor external, cause nor effect, concept nor thing, but envelops both of these polarities. Along with the dynamic fact, the psychological fact, there is psychological movements making themselves into thoughts. There are also tendencies and inclinations, which we cannot directly perceive, but make themselves known to us in their results. Bergson's attention remains always tied to the question of how. How does thought emerge from fact? How do facts appear? How do they develop and evolve our thinking? To comprehend facts, we must investigate the how more than the what or the why. Bergson describes psychological states as living entities, organized, self-making, and self-aware, in the manner of organisms. In like manner, he explores the facts of immediate consciousness as continuous with the push of life, and frequently turns to consider the implications of evolution and biology on psychology, as well as to critique those reductionists he calls the evolutionists. As already in Time and Free Will, we see Bergson draw on the often neglected third major work of Darwin, the expression of the emotions in man and animal. He builds on Darwin's compatibilist view of emotion, gesture, and idea. While Darwin tends in favor of physiology and evolutionary utility to explain emotions, he does not resort to epiphenomenalism or pure reductionism. Ideas are engines of movement, directing our effort, but an idea is given its force and authority from emotions. No idea will prolong itself into movements without an accompanying emotional richness, passion, and attitude. Emotion both prepares the body and authorizes the translation of an idea into concrete action. Bergson rejects every classification, every theory that asserts a strictly mechanistic view of life and the psyche. Like his mentor, Jules Lachelier, he substitutes everywhere the immediate facts of life and freedom for the abstract explanation of mechanism and determinism. An idea, interpenetrated by emotions and systems of bodily movements, is far more than a fossilized residue of a spiritual activity. It is a vital, dynamic factor in the duration of human consciousness. From this investigation into psychological facts, Bergson releases or makes emerge a profound experiential-based psychology that generates his philosophy of life. Here I'm riffing on his own ambiguous use of the term dégager, which has no single English equivalent but encompasses the meaning of to open, to liberate, to extricate, to free, to unlock, as well as to emerge, to exit, to emit, to give off. And again, it can mean to reveal, to uncover, to show. And finally, it can also mean to extract, to excavate, to derive, or to clear out. Bergson exploits the ambiguity of this term, which can be traced in the following examples. A more complex psychological state can emerge from prior simpler states. Likewise, the investigation of certain psychological phenomena will release or reveal certain conclusions or problems. Finally, our generalities and abstractions are not immediately given in perception, but need to be freed up, extricated, or made available. In each case, some new fact emerges, freeing or revealing itself, or rather, making itself. Among the most interesting arguments explained here, again, perhaps more clearly than in the published works, is Bergson's critique of associationism and the emergence of general ideas. In an argument that seems ahead of its time, found later in Gestalt psychology developed by Merleau-Ponty and more recently by enactivism, after critiquing reductionist and mechanistic views of association, going back at least to David Hume, he affirms the view that there are prototypical forms of abstraction found in embodied motricity, habituation, and attitudes, which form a set of natural bases on which a seemingly unlimited number of artificial abstractions can emerge. He suggests that we first sense the existence of our own attitude and habits as the coordination of movements and feelings, which, on reflection, appears to remain unchanged in variable conditions. From this fact, we are inspired to consider other facts by analogy, such as separable from the web of sensations. It's possible to be in the same environment on a different occasion and have a different emotional state or a different attitude. We can encounter things at different times with different attitudes. We experience this, we know this, and we reason by analogy from this to think about substances, about this abstract, practical concept, right? That a thing persists in time and has certain attributes which we can attribute to it. We see our attitude as detachable from the momentary changes of our sense perception and extrapolate from this experience the concept of an abstraction more generally, which then guides our intellect to replicate this sort of abstraction and extraction within perception and elsewhere. Voila, science is born, and it immediately marches towards solid, inert concepts, gems mined from the fluidity of experience. Psychologists and philosophers are led to see color, sound, things like that, as extractable from the green of this leaf or the pitch of this tone. In short, it is by an analogy with our own inner life that we come to comprehend the possibility of continuously developing and enriching our symbols and sciences. We are creatures who harbor the possibility of indefinitely expanding, enriching signs. In this sense, we transcend the limitations of our signs, of our logic and concepts, precisely insofar as we can expand and transform them. And Bergson is using the word sign in a slightly strange way here. All of our sensations, all of the facts of our experience, every impression made on our consciousness, as he says, is only a sign for the scientist, and the object of science is precisely to provide its interpretation. And the same could be said of all sciences other than psychology. Metaphysics itself can only consider conscious facts, ideas, but it ceases to be psychology and becomes metaphysics when it treats these facts as signs, as symbols, seeking only to interpret them. And so to treat our sensations and our experiences and our facts as a psychologist means to not treat them as signs, or at least to cease interpreting them. It will instead observe and categorize them. While there is something like a natural tendency for languages to become more abstract, more conceptual, there is a counter tendency seen in an artist's effort to describe or elicit emotions, in a true work of invention, and in the philosopher's effort to return to concrete duration. No matter how static and eternal our systems of knowledge appear at a given moment in history, the study of the evolution of doctrines shows a continuous evolutionary movement, as he would later present in his courses at the Collège de France. The generality and abstraction needed for reasoning are natural, But these tendencies can easily go into excess, and unrestrained will lead to the abandonment of the concrete vitality from which they emerged and erect an eternity of death, as he'll later say, in the form of symbolic deterministic systems. This is where naturalist reductive empiricism demands mechanistic determinism. Even in intellectualism, becomes deterministic in its very structure of knowledge and of consciousness. In short, this is where our intellectual nature turns against itself, and at the point at which we need a conversion that following Plotinus, comes from a turn inward. It is consciousness as a process of fact-making, making itself, being set in motion by the evidence of these facts and acts that the science of psychology engenders or makes itself. Ultimately, we are each a multiplicity of psychological states with varying degrees of convergence and compartmentalization. We are not a clear and self-same unit or substance, but rather personality is an ecosystem of movements, emotions, tendencies, habits, and ideas forming a complex coordination and disjunction of conscious and unconscious states. The unity of our life is not something we think or generate through an active synthesis. The representation of the self is little more than an illusory concept, greatly impoverished by its derivative status, and if taken as fundamental, will unfailingly lead to false psychological and metaphysical problems. We find our personality in its concrete multiplicity and its transformations. Otherwise, we live it transparently and unconsciously. And as we'll see, our understanding of the self, of ourself, of personality, of our own experience, is going to affect our psychology. And so for Bergson, in order to properly do psychology, we need to be revising these ideas of how we understand the self and experience. So Bergson outlines 5 features of psychological facts. First, they do not occupy space. They are sensations that are felt in their entirety, but are not localized in some part of existence or of experience. The psychological fact eludes direct measurement. While physical facts and physiological facts can be measured and have to be measured for them to be understood clearly, the psychological fact cannot be understood through measurement. And the psychological fact is unstable. It is change. It is composed of changes. It is nothing but change. It endures, Bergson says. It has a living duration to it, at which no moment is identical to another. Even a sensation is something that changes as it's prolonged. And our experience is constantly enriching itself, and as he says, coils over on itself, and becomes more detailed and complex through our experience and through our memory. The fourth feature is that it cannot be understood as a distinct multiplicity. It cannot be placed in space. It cannot be situated one part next to another and looked at straight on. Instead, we have a series of psychical facts that overlap and prolong into the next and interpenetrate. And this continuity is not capable of being represented or measured or conceived in physical space. And he says that, whereas physical facts are something that is in the public domain, psychical facts constitute a domain unique to each of us. Consciousness, he says, pertains to the inner life and is generally opposed to the senses. Thus, one might say that the physical facts are perceived by the senses and psychological facts by consciousness. And all of our facts, the ones that we use in science, are at one time psychological. They are the data of our thought. And so it seems that psychology is the science of all reality. And Bergson questions this and says, is every fact a psychological one? And he answers no, while affirming that every scientific fact has a share in our psychological reality. He says if physical facts were, at their core, psychological facts for the physicist, then psychological methods would be applicable in physics, at least to certain problems. Yet they are entirely excluded. Physical sciences are independent of all psychology, and yet all reality can only be known as a fact conscious in our as a psychological fact. Every known reality is a psychological reality, but how do we resolve this antinomy? By analyzing, he says, the procedures of natural science, we will see that although they always begin with observations, and every observation breaks down into sensations, that is, into psychological facts, they never retain the sensations or the conscious facts. They always consider it as a sign or a symbol, attributing to it the value of a symbol. And he'll go on to show here that it is by treating our sensation as symbols that either science or metaphysics begins. It is the way in which they treat it as a symbol that differs. But symbol here is giving us this sense of the evidence from which thought begins. And on the one hand, it begins thinking scientifically, and on the other hand, it begins thinking metaphysically. So he says, every immediately given reality is a psychological reality, and every fact, considered in its brute state and as an immediate known, is a psychological fact. If certain facts or certain systems of these facts are considered purely symbolic, as signs of a reality of a different order, we move from psychology to any of the other sciences of reality. The only appropriate definition of the psychological fact is the following. We call psychological facts the immediately known facts seen in themselves and not interpreted as symbols. But within the immediate facts of our consciousness, we find a reality that is not purely deterministic. We find indeterminacy and freedom within our pure series of conscious facts and inner facts. So for Bergson, we start doing psychology when we treat our inner states as these organic, self-organizing processes that are involving indeterminacy and cannot be understood entirely mechanistically. He is going to look at the role of mechanism within thought and within intelligence. And here again, he is drawing a lot, or is inspired in the same way as Pierre Genet. They're working at the same time. And, Bergson is reading his work, so there's definitely some inspiration there. But I think there's also coevolution that is independent in Bergson. He's not stealing these ideas from Genet or anything like that. But anyway, the idea is the automatism, that there are certain things that happen in the mind automatically. You can think here of habits. You form certain habits of thought, and you'll think that way without, noticing it, or without deciding to begin thinking that way. Once a habit is formed, it becomes almost a mechanical operation. If I had to think about how I formed every single word, I wouldn't be able to actually be able to think in the way that I need to speak. Part of that process becomes automated as a kind of automata. And we see this idea actually going all the way back to people like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. Leibniz uses this phrase from Spinoza, the psychological automata. It's a self-moving thought that our consciousness is not operating, is not actively guiding and enacting. And Bergson will start out Matter and Memory in the preface by stating that intelligence arises in action and practical reasoning, and it carries certain features of practical utility along with it into intelligence, and this causes all the problems in psychology and in philosophy. It is only by interrupting our habits and the habits of the intellect that we can begin to do psychology, and then from there we can go to metaphysics, a new form of metaphysics, as we'll see, that does not use symbols, dispenses with symbols.